So, I just finished Dark Souls 3, and by just finished, I mean I finished it a few months ago, in June actually, but I've been mulling it over for a while, partly because I've been so busy with other projects, stuff coming soon, I'll update you at the end of the video, but partly because I feel Dark Souls 3 requires that. It's the kind of game that has a lot to say, yet doesn't say it all up front. There's a lot laying beneath the surface, there's layers to peel back, there's a lot of depth here, and it's a game that I think you can interpret in a ton of different ways, but it resonated with me very specifically, and I think there's plenty worth saying here. So strap in, let's jump in and let's talk about Dark Souls 3. Although, a couple little bits of housekeeping at the top of the video. If you've never seen a video like this, I'm playing through all of the Souls games. I explained my history with them in my Dark Souls 1 video, so if you want to go and check that out, the playlist will be linked below if you want to go see what I thought about Dark Souls 1 and 2. And if you're watching this in years to come, then maybe I've already done Sekiro, Elden Ring by that time. I also streamed most of my time with Dark Souls 3, about half the game actually, so I'll link that playlist in the description too if you want to see some of my time with it. I didn't stream all of it, but I streamed a decent amount, and I did stream the ending, so that's all there. I decided to use the trying to process format so that I'm able to talk about these games a little bit more off the cuff, a little bit more just sort of off the top of my head. Scripting takes so long, and so I don't want to script every single video that I make. Sometimes it's nice to just sit down in front of the mic with a few notes and just, you know, wax poetic about something. And so because of that, my thoughts aren't concrete, they're not set in stone, I'm not married to necessarily any of these ideas. It's something that will develop over time as I replay the games and maybe write videos on them and engage in discussions about them. So this is more just off the top of my head, after just playing the game, what exactly do I think, where do I land, and how do I interpret a lot of its themes. So let's go. Now, going into Dark Souls 3, I knew this was a popular one. I always see it come up. A lot of people in the comments of my other Souls-related videos have said, like, oh, I can't wait for you to play Dark Souls 3, and the other one is always Sekiro, which will come down the line, we'll get there. And so I knew going into this that people love Dark Souls 3. I knew that it was one of the fan favourites, so I was looking forward to seeing what the game had in store. My playthrough consisted of very similar stuff to the other two videos, if you've seen them. I usually play Dexterity, that's just the way I like to play. I vibe with it the best. I used the Sellsword Twin Blades, is that what they're called, for the whole game, because it turned out how well they scaled once you use sharpness on them or something. I got it. It's been so long now that I'm forgetting like the specifics of those things, but it scaled so well with Dex, and it just made me feel good, and I liked how they played, so that worked, and I liked playing that way, very similarly to the way that I played Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, although because these swords that I started the game with were so good, I didn't do much experimenting with other weapons, whereas in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2, I switched them out and tried new things, whereas with this, it was just like, they were just so good that I just kept them for the whole thing, which, you know, wasn't a detriment to my experience, but it just means I didn't experience a vast array of weapons on my first playthrough, but I'm sure when I go back, I'll try different builds, I'll try experimenting with things, but that was my build this go around, and it was really fun. I loved it. I think it played great, and it feels really good, just like, you know, the other Souls games do. It just feels great, works well, mechanically solid, and I like the playstyle. And again, I try to play these blind, so when I am streaming, I don't really get chat to tell me what to do unless it's something super important, or if it's something where I'm like, oh, I really don't know what to do, give me a hand sort of thing. And the same when I'm playing on my own, I don't want to follow like tons of guides or anything like that. Unless I find something, I'm like, oh, I wonder what this does, I'll just sort of look it up. Because like I've said in previous videos, it feels like part of the experience in a way of these games. It's like you find something like, oh, I wonder what this does, you look it up, there's like a little forum post. There's that community aspect to it, which is why I also like the little notes people leave too. Like, I don't know, that's an element of it that I find fun. I don't want to follow a guide for the whole video, but or for the whole game, but you know, I do want to, you know, sometimes engage in that sort of community of it all, which I think is quite fun. But that's my general experience. That's sort of how I went into this game. That's how I played it. Let's talk about the actual substance now. The actual gameplay loop, the sort of level design, sort of moment-to-moment gameplay, was very, very strong. It reminded me a lot more of Bloodborne than the other Souls games, which makes sense given Bloodborne was the game just before it, and it's like, you know, very similar graphically. But design-wise, it did feel very Bloodborne-y, and it was almost like a Souls game, but with a Bloodborne coat of paint in a way. There was like this sort of melding of things, and it sort of ended up feeling like this sort of mixing pot of FromSoft ideas that have sort of come and gone, which at first, I will say, I found derivative. At first, I found like, oh, this is kind of a bit too homogenous rather than being innovative. But it turns out actually that I think that was absolutely the point. And as I got further through the game, I sort of came to realize, oh, I get what they're doing here. This makes a lot of sense. It makes so much sense that my initial reaction was, oh, this feels like a bit too homogenous, because of exactly what the game is going for. And actually, I really love that decision, if it was intentional and based on, you know, the way that I sort of found myself feeling towards the end. It's very much more similar to Dark Souls. Well, I don't know. I guess the way that it generally plays is a lot more similar to Dark Souls 1 than Dark Souls 2. It feels like a sort of return to its roots. You could see that as a backtrack, sort of like a backstep of a sort of like, oh, okay, you didn't really like Dark Souls 2, we'll go back to the original. Which I guess it does feel like at the beginning, but then I think the point of it becomes clear later on. You realize that everything sort of comes together and fits, and we'll talk a bit about that in the theme and story section of the video, like I always do, sort of towards the end part. And so generally, in terms of sort of progression and the way the levels work, I think it's very refined, it's very well crafted, and that feels super rewarding. The way that it uses shortcuts, the way that it uses exploration to reward the player, it feels very Bloodborne, more than it does Dark Souls 1 even. Because I think that Bloodborne, in a way, refined that sort of style of world design. So it makes sense. It makes sense that it feels more like Bloodborne. But there is that element of, I still do miss the deep interconnectedness of Dark Souls 1, which so far through my playthroughs has never really been replicated. The way that everything sort of like loops back around to Firelink was pretty beautiful. But I also think the structure of this game and the way that it's very linear actually helps the themes. I think it's supposed to be that way. So I'm not mad. I don't think Dark Souls 3 would be better if it was structured like Dark Souls 1. But it is something I miss because it was very unique, and I really liked that about Dark Souls 1. One of the things I did notice about this, though, was the difficulty at the beginning was kicking my ass, like, a lot, which was crazy, because the other games I feel like I've jumped in and it's been pretty simple, and then the difficulty ramps up at certain points, but like, you start off and it's not too hard, right? But I felt like in this, like when I was at the High Wall of Lothric, I was getting demolished. I was like, fuck, this is tough. And I think I had to adapt to it, because I think there is a sort of, you need to be more aggressive in Dark Souls 3 than you are in the other Dark Souls games. A little bit more similar to something like Bloodborne, the way that it rewards the player being aggressive and running in, but without that sort of gaining your health back mechanic. So it's a little bit more dangerous, which is obviously, you know, Dark Souls. But that was something that I think I had to adapt to, was I was playing the game a little different, and by playing it the way that I played the original first two games, especially coming out of Dark Souls 2, which is a game that is very unique and different. Like, I very much had to adapt. I very much had to adapt to the way the game was built, and I think that allowed me to sort of see it in a totally new way. And I think by the midpoint of the game, I was doing fine. I was sort of breezing my way through. But it did take me a couple of areas before I adapted and realized, okay, I need to start playing this a bit differently to, you know, even Dark Souls 1, which is a little bit more defensive, which I think overall was more fun. I think overall it made the experience better. And so I enjoyed that sort of aspect of it. But I think, like I said, the world design, the level design, it's very compact and tight-knit, and I think the exploration is always rewarded. I love the way it uses a lot of its shortcuts. Like, they're very shortcuts, which again is very Bloodborne. The way that you get a shortcut and you're like, oh, this loops right back to the beginning. Like, it cuts the whole level out, and it's like, that feels good. There's something about that when you unlock that door and you realize you're right back at the first bonfire, and it's like, that's a shortcut right to the boss. You're like, oh, that is great. That felt good. And they're always like, it's not obvious as well. Like, you do have to explore a little bit, and then you find it, and it feels nice. And I like that. I think that's good, and I think it you know, generally feels really, really nice. But to talk, I guess, about the actual linearity of it and the way that it pushes you through the world, I think it's important to be linear, like I said before, because of what the game's trying to explore. So the way the game is built is a lot different in that you don't spread out from a single point. You do go on sort of like a linear progression, which, you know, is very similar to Bloodborne in that way, that you're not spreading out from a single place. The single place is almost like isolated and separate, which it's difficult to say whether I prefer that or not. I think I generally don't, but I think for a game like Dark Souls 3, it works to a great effect, because as you're being pushed through this world, as you're going forwards through a linear progression of different areas, it starts to become a lot more incomprehensible. You know what I mean? And not in a Dark Souls 2 way. Well, maybe in a bit of a Dark Souls 2 way, but in a way where, I mean, look, the biggest moment was when, you know, around a third of the way through the game, maybe a bit more, you reach Anor Londo. That was a moment, and, I mean, look, let me just play my reaction now. Whoa, hang on a minute. Whoa! Wait, what the fuck? No way! Wait, how did we get here? What? Holy shit, this is so weird. Oh my god, and this is the bridge! I knew I recognized that thing. I just thought it was because, oh, it's the same piece of architecture, but no, it's the same swivel bridge. Holy shit, it's the big stairs! Wait, so that's where Duke's Archive would be, right? Right? Where did this huge city come from? Oh my god! What the fuck? This is fucking insane! I think this was the moment where the level design clicked for me. Because like I said, up until this point, I felt that it was quite derivative. It was just very, like, run-of-the-mill Souls. And I was a bit like, oh, this isn't blowing me away. The other games, I felt like they were built in such a way where I was like, oh, this feels really unique, very cool. I feel like I'm feeling my way through exploring this new sort of game. Whereas in Dark Souls 3, I was like, oh, I'm just playing a Souls game, and it's very much a Souls game, like derivative of what I know. But when I got to Anor Londo, I was like, oh, that's the point. It's supposed to be, because you get to Anor Londo, and it's seeped in this green, sickly hue. You explore, and it's this place from the first game that has just been ripped and dumped somewhere else. It's just as you're going through, you're like, oh, here's just a very obvious piece of Dark Souls iconography where it absolutely should not be, because that's not where Anor Londo is. It's just here now for some reason, and that made me realize what the game was trying to do on a thematic level with its level design, which is to create this sense of, it is this melting pot, but it's the game folding in on itself. It's the game that is just, it is the Dark Souls, it's Dark Souls on purpose. And I think that's what creates the eerie nature of Anor Londo in this game, is that it's not really supposed to be here. And you realize the game is this like patchwork collation of Dark Souls-isms for the sake of it. And that's what it's trying to be. It's trying to be a critique on its own sort of form, in a way. That's sort of what it's trying to say, and that's what you get to by the end when you realize what everything's saying, and the idea of letting things go and not hanging on and you know, clutching on to what was, you know, in the hope of comfort, but in, like, embracing the new. But we'll talk about themes a bit later on. I just sort of wanted to touch upon the Anor Londo section in terms of, like, level design, because it was the moment when I realized what the level design was doing. And I think then it reframed the way I viewed the game as we pushed on to later areas. And even when when the game loops back around and you end up in untended graves, when you end up back there, and it's like Dark Souls 3 is even looping back around on itself in a way that doesn't make any sense. It's like being self-referential to itself, and that whole sort of aspect of it. And I think it's so elegantly done in such a way that it makes the earlier parts of the game recontextualized, so that when I go back and I look at those, I'm like, oh god, I can see what they're doing. It's so wonderful in such a interesting and artistic way. But general level design, I thought, was, you know, the actual, like, level design stripped back from the sort of, like, the visual elements, just the way that it was built was wonderful, rewarding, satisfying, engaging. The enemy placement and things like that, like, I don't really have too much to say on a combat level here, because I feel like everything I've talked about with regards to Souls is stuff that I've talked about before. This game is as mechanically competent as it's always been, if not more so. And so I find it hard to sit here and just praise the combat again, because yes, it is mechanically built well. The weapons feel good. The way that you dodge feels responsive, and it's well timed. The enemies' attack patterns, the way that enemies are placed and grouped in ways that just are perfectly challenging, but without being bullshit. Variety in enemy design, their different abilities, the way that you have to adapt, you know, learning to dodge, learning those attack patterns, and being tested by these different enemies, which are very aggressive and very hard in this game. Like I said before, I feel like the difficulty is just turned up a little bit, so that I always felt like I was on the back foot, which was nice for a change, because I felt like I was way too overpowered in both Dark Souls, and especially Dark Souls 2, to be honest. I felt quite overpowered in that, despite some of the bullshit. I felt like I just had a handle on that from the start. Whereas this one, I felt like I really had to work for it. And I think the increased challenge there was really helpful. And I think that was something that was probably learned a bit by Bloodborne. And it becomes harder taking out the ability to regain health as well. So you end up in this position where you're really struggling to keep a hold on things. And I think it works in a really, really wonderful way. I think the aggressiveness of the enemies too encourages you to be more aggressive, like I was talking about before. The enemies are kind of relentless in a lot of ways. Those little weird like goblin guys that jump around and shit, those annoyed me in some areas, but like in the best way that you can be annoyed, I guess. And I think a lot of enemies too had that Bloodborne-ism of like, they seem passive, and then all of a sudden they'll release like 13 hits in one go and kill you sort of thing, and just like, you better kill them before they kill you, and like enemies that will affect other enemies with like the lantern things and stuff, which will empower each other and things like that were very common in Bloodborne, but not so much in Dark Souls 1 and 2, although there were a couple, which I think puts the player in a position where you need to get in there, deal with the things that are the most risky or the most dangerous, and then fall back to fight the stragglers and not die, lose as little health as possible, and then push on sort of thing, which I think works really nicely. And I think paired with that aggressive sort of style of play is the sort of the L2 moves, or I can't remember what controller I was using, but the sort of secondary usage of each sort of weapon. Obviously, I only use the Sellsword Twin Blades, so that's all I'm familiar with, but the way that I used that move more than the normal attacks, unless it was like a super weak enemy, or just like one guy that I wanted to just kill sort of just with a quick slash, then I would use, your normal R1s. But a lot of the time, I fell back on using the L2 move, or the L1 move, or whichever one it was, I can't remember now. But you can see it in the footage. I use it all the time because it was very powerful. It was also very quick, and I always felt that it worked well in certain scenarios when I was trying to be aggressive. And I really, really liked that ability to sort of choose between the two types. And I think the aggressive enemies paired with my more aggressive style of play just made those things work together. And I really enjoyed that mechanic. I really didn't spend much of my time using a shield. I had a shield, and I think that was just because it increased stamina. It was like the crest shield, which I used in like all of the games. Also, using Lucatiel's armor was sweet. I loved that because I loved Lucatiel in Dark Souls 2, so it was awesome to wear that armor around for pretty much the whole game. But yeah, I never really used a shield. I rarely parried in this game, to be honest with you. It felt way more useful to just rush in, go on the offensive, rather than sitting behind a shield or trying to parry, which maybe other people use that more than me, but in this game, for some reason, I didn't. Whereas in Dark Souls 1 and 2, I did quite a bit. And I even did in Bloodborne with the gun and stuff. It just didn't feel right to me in Dark Souls 3, which is interesting. I don't really have much to say on the matter, but it was interesting nonetheless. And I guess that takes us on to talking a little bit about bosses. I feel like I've skipped over a lot of stuff here, and I normally go into a bit more detail, but I guess it's, for me, the thing that resonated the most with Dark Souls 3 was the themes, and the presentation of it all, more so than the mechanics, because the mechanics were great, like, near flawless. They were just fantastic. The boss fights were all so good, like, the ones that stood out to me, Vort, Abyss Watchers, Pontiff Sullivan, Aldrich, Dancer, Dragon Slayer, Gundyr, Prince Lothric. Like, they were such brilliant boss fights. And, into the DLC too, some wonderful ones in there. And, the Nameless King as well. So many really, really good boss fights that are just so mechanically beautiful, in a way that when you look back at Dark Souls 1 and you see, like, Dark Souls 1 has some great fights, don't get me wrong, Dark Souls 1 has some great fights, but I think a lot of what makes Dark Souls 1 is the atmosphere, the ambience, and the themes, because, and the level design too, and all of that comes together to make this, like, harmonious, like, beautiful game. But when you actually look just in a vacuum at the boss fights and their mechanics, they're not that complex, are they? And the same goes for Demon Souls. Like, Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1, they're very, very simple boss fights that aren't particularly difficult. They're just sort of like very cool and fun. But I think that when you look at something like Bloodborne and then Dark Souls 3, you can see what they've done with their boss fights is they've taken them to this other level in a way that takes what worked about those first Souls games and was fun and was engaging, really takes it to a place where they are so damn thoughtful. Like Abyss Watchers, what a fucking fight. What an incredible fight. And the same goes for a lot of these ones. Like Pontiff Sullivan was another really, really good one. And to be fair to me, like if you watch my streams and you go towards some of the end, like I was ridiculously overpowered. I don't know how it happened. Again, like everyone in chat, this happens every single time. Everyone in chat is like, we don't know how you've done this. And I also don't know how I've done it. I'm just playing the game. I don't grind for souls. I've never done that. I don't, really try to, get the best possible build or anything like that. I just play with the one that feels good. Like, if you watch my Elden Ring playthrough, like, you know, that I never really finished. It was just like I played a bit of it, which is why, you know, as part of this series, I'll be playing it properly for the first time. If you watch me play Elden Ring at all, you'll see people in chat being like, oh no, you should do this, you should do that, because I don't know what I'm doing. I just do what feels good. And somehow, I guess I just got lucky, I don't know. And by the end, I did end up with a really OP character. And so I think I did sort of cheese, I didn't cheese them, I just fought them normally, I was just really powerful. So I managed to get through some of the bosses very quickly, but despite that, I still really appreciated those fights. Like, I think, in particular, some of the ones that stood out to me was in the DLC. Because, yes, I did play the DLC this time. I'm sorry that I didn't play the DLC for Dark Souls 2. I will go back and do it. I apologize. And the DLC itself is really cool. I really enjoyed both the Painted World and the Ring City. Like, I thought they were just really, really good. I mean, Ring City is gorgeous and offers some really unique experiences and encounters and challenge as well. And I thought all that was really, really cool, especially, like, thematically, too. I thought it all worked really, really well. I think my feelings on the DLC, despite, like, critically looking at it and being like, they're great, and they add to the game really well, there is an element of, like, as I'm playing through, I don't like playing the DLC. It's a weird experience, and I think when you play the game for the first time, as much as they fit into the game very well, when you're playing through the game for the first time on release, the DLC is not out. So you finish the game, then the DLC comes out, you come back, you do the DLC, and it adds to the ending of the game. Like, you feel like, oh, I've added a bit more context here, and sort of that's what's there. But when I'm playing through for the first time and the DLC is all there, I don't really want to take time out to go and do this DLC that came out after the game. I kind of want to just push on with the game. It feels like a detour to me. Even if maybe it's not, it feels like one. And maybe that's just something in my head, but I thought it was worth noting that that's sort of how it generally makes me feel, which is why I didn't do the ones in Dark Souls 2, because I felt that they felt like a detour, and I was like, I just kind of want to push on with the main game. I didn't feel like going off on, you know, doing these other things. Weirdly, I don't think I felt that with Dark Souls 1, but maybe I did. I don't remember. It's been too long. I don't know. I enjoyed both the DLCs for Dark Souls 3. I really did. But they did at points feel like, although they were working thematically, I did feel like I wasn't making any progress towards the final boss. I felt very aware that I was doing something separate and side and not really part of the sort of main path. Which I think puts me off it a little bit. Maybe in the future it would be better to play it after the main game. Potentially. I don't really know, but that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how that plays into Elden Ring with the DLC that just came out. It will be interesting to see whether that fits in to the main game or whether that's something to maybe play afterwards. Yeah, anyway, that's sort of just generally how I felt about the DLC itself. Not too much to say on that, although the bosses were really, really cool. Like, Sister Frieda, I don't know how you say that. She was amazing. Such a great fight. That fight was so much fun. I loved that one. And again, obviously evocative of Priscilla from the Painted World in Dark Souls 1, because again, it's being self-referential on purpose. It's not just like derivative by mistake. It's purposely being like, look at this. It's just another thing from Dark Souls 1. It's just another thing you've seen before, and it's doing that on purpose. But the fight itself was brilliant too. Midir was such a fun fucking fight. That fight made me mad because it was the first time I was actually challenged in a way where I'm like, oh, my build is not OP enough now. I actually just have to get good at the game, and that was a great challenge. I loved Midir. I thought that was brilliant. And my god, Slave Knight Gale. Oh, what a fucking fight. That's one of my favorites. That might be my favorite fight in the game, to be honest with you. That was such a fun fight. I loved it. And I think what made it was the thematic harmony of it all. What Gale represents for Dark Souls 3 within the context of Dark Souls and in the context of that whole Painted World storyline. Oh my god, it was just phenomenal. It was so fucking good, and it all just resonates, and it comes together in just this amazing way where you start to realize what everything means, and it recontextualizes the game. And even talking about this now, sitting here talking about this, like, is like reflecting on it, I still think Dark Souls 1 might be my favorite, but god, Dark Souls 3 is a very close second, partly because of its mechanical prowess, which is just better than Dark Souls 1. There's no doubt in my mind that it's better than Dark Souls 1 as a mechanical, piece. But thematically too, the way that it uses Dark Souls 1 to say what it says is so wonderful, and it does it without disregarding Dark Souls 1 and being cynical at the same time. You know what? If I have any more random little bits to say at the end, I will, but I think we need to jump into the game thematically, because there is so much I really want to say about this, because it really struck me in a particular way. So let's do that. Look, I want to say right now, before getting into the themes of it all, because a lot of people take this the wrong way sometimes. I have seen people read the game the same way that I have, and people in chat were reading it with me too in the same way, and we sort of like were throwing ideas at each other. Sort of it ended up, culminating in this sort of like, my understanding of the game in a particular light, which is the way that everything came together for me to really appreciate it. But I think I've seen people talk about this, and a lot of people don't appreciate it, or will shoot it down and be like, no, you're just thinking about it too much, or they'll take offense to it and will actually think that, no, you're trying to say that Dark Souls hates Dark Souls, which isn't the point. I don't think that's what Dark Souls 3 is saying. I don't think Dark Souls 3 is saying fuck Dark Souls and fuck the fans. But it is a very cynical game, but it does it in a way that is like a beautiful expression, like a passionate expression of cynicism. And I think that's what makes the game so admirable. I think that's why people like it, because it's not just one of those games that is trying to be critical of its own franchise and sort of trips over itself and fails to do that. You look at something like the Saints Row reboot, for example, which I made a big video on. That game is very clearly hates itself. It hates Saints Row. And it's cynical, and it's critical of Saints Row as a franchise, but it does it in a way that's mean-spirited and not very nice. Whereas Dark Souls 3 is critical of Dark Souls, but it's also a huge thank you to Dark Souls as well. It's both. It's trying to be both things. It's a, please, I really want to move on. We can't keep clinging onto the past. We can't keep clinging onto what was and trying to recreate that magic. But at the same time, Dark Souls will be in every single thing that we make, from now on. It will always be there. It's always in the DNA of the games we make, whether it's Bloodborne, whether it's Sekiro, whether it's Elden Ring. Dark Souls will always be there, will always be a part of it. And it's a big thank you to Dark Souls as well as being a goodbye and a critical look at prolonging something that needs to end, that needs to die, which is, again, a lot of the themes of the first game, but this game looks at that on a meta level, because Dark Souls 1 uses the flame and trying to put continue the flame or to leave the flame, the Age of Fire or the Age of Dark, perpetuate things or let it die, but that it does that within the context of its story. Dark Souls 3 does it within the context of its story too, in a really beautiful way, but it also does it in the context of its own creation, of its own, existence as a piece of art, and it feels like it comes from, Miyazaki's very soul as he's worked on these games. It comes out in such a beautiful way that doesn't feel... It's cynical without feeling mean-spirited, and I think that's an incredible thing to try and balance. And I think that's why a lot of people take this analysis in particular as a negative one, as one where we're trying to say that, oh, Dark Souls hates itself, it hates the fans, it thinks you're stupid, because that's not the case at all. But there is an element of cynicism in there, which I think is what makes it so powerful, especially towards the end, and especially with characters like Gale. And that's why I think the themes of this game are particularly unparalleled, and that's why the game being derivative is the point. That's why when you play the game and you think, wow, this just kind of feels like Bloodborne mixed with Dark Souls stuff in the past, and you're like, oh, this feels really derivative, that's the point. And as you get further and further through the game, it becomes more obviously derivative while becoming more mechanically unique. And that, I think, was a clever design choice, is that at the beginning it feels very safe, very homogenous, very what you've come to expect, but in a way that is not overt. But then as it becomes more overt, when you end up in fucking Anor Londo is just slapped down in the middle of Irithyll, and you're like, what the fuck is going on? And as it becomes an overt reference to itself, the mechanics become more unique, and the game becomes more unique itself in the way that it's built, while everything is referencing itself. You come across those characters like Gunda and like the Dragon Slayer, and you're like, oh, this is stuff I've seen before. This is just reusing things, like, very unapologetically going, here's a thing from Dark Souls, go and fight that again. And it become like, it's very much just like, you just want to see Dark Souls things, don't you? That's what you want to see. Go on, do that. And it feels like the midpoint almost in... I'm trying to think of like an example, but to me it like resonates musically. Not music from Dark Souls, but what they're doing almost feels musical in the sense of it gets more and more... the pot never boils over, but it continues as it goes from the point when you get to Anor Londo to around the point at the very end of the game. It continues bubbling and bubbling more and more and more aggressively, at the point where like the game is almost shouting at you and then it settles, and it's like it got all of that out. It's like it spends a huge amount of its runtime venting at you. It's like it's like you can feel the artist talking to you through it. You can feel what it's saying, and it's just like this sort of, the cynicism is obviously there, but it's also this, like, there is a little bit of vitriol, and there is a little bit of like resentment too, and it like the game being what it is and expressing itself gets that out. It vents all of those frustrations across the game as it gets more and more aggressive, and there's more overt references to itself, and the game folds in on itself, and you end back at the graves from the beginning, and you're fighting these bosses you've seen before, and everything gets like more and more and more, and the mechanics start ramping up, and then it just cuts. It's like an orchestra cutting out, and then it's just calm. Then it's just an appreciation of Dark Souls after that point. It gets all of the frustrations out. You literally fight a representation of yourself at the end as the music harkens back to Dark Souls 1. And then it says, thank you for playing these games. Thank you for giving us a platform, and we're gonna move on and do other things. But everything we make from now on will always have the DNA of Dark Souls in it because it's a part of us. But, and this is my like sort of take on this, is we're never going to make another one because it's over and it needs to end. That's the point, right? I feel like that is the point of Dark Souls 3, is them saying that we love Dark Souls, we appreciate everyone, but Dark Souls has to end. Because if you cling on to art for too long and cling on to the thing that made you popular, you're going to be miserable at the expense of popularity. And sometimes you need to ignore that. And in doing so, you'll end up reaching new heights of greatness, as we've seen with Elden Ring. I think Dark Souls 3's message has only aged better with the release of Sekiro and Elden Ring, in that you look at those games and you're like, yeah, they exactly did it. The message that you get when you speak to, I forget the NPC's name, but when you go back to the little hut in the painted world, and the little painter who's looking for the particular pigment, which is what Gale was searching for, the pigment from the Dark Soul, like literally painting using the Dark Soul, like, and it's this canvas that's been repainted, and that's why the painted world is like so reminiscent of Dark Souls 1's painted world, because it's like the same thing being repainted, and it's being repainted in the same image, and it's like Dark Souls again and again and again. It's just fucking Dark Souls. We just keep doing it. But now, with what we've done across the game, and the building also, you know, on fire too, is quite a good little, you know, piece of symbolism, like, you know, rebirth from flame, blah blah blah, especially with flame being a huge part of, you know, this game. I think that you hand over that Dark Soul pigment, and it's like what they say to you, the sort of the line that is spoken. I'll insert a clip here.
My thanks, Ashen One. With this will I paint a world. Please tell me thy name. I would name this painting after thee. My thanks. I will paint a world of that name. 'Twill be a cold, dark, and very gentle place. And one day, it will make someone a goodly home.
Is this idea of now painting something new with the Dark Soul, and that just speaks to me so strongly, in that don't forget where you came from, don't forget those things that molded you and made you, and don't disregard those, even if you feel annoyed that you're attached to them. Always remember that part of what made your art special, and then use that to make something new, which is what we see in Sekiro and Elden Ring, the DNA of Souls in something brand new, rather than just trying to do the same thing, repaint the exact same image again and again. It's so beautiful. It's such a beautiful game, man. I love it. Artistically, it's fucking phenomenal. And that's the thing. They could have done this game in a way that feels cynical, in a way that feels mean-spirited. Like I keep saying, they could have done that, but they don't. They actually made one of the best games they've ever made, one of the most beautiful games, one of the most elaborate mechanically, one of the best designed in terms of its level structure, like all of those things. They made one of the best games they could have done, all while saying it's time for this shit to end. But they did it on the most beautiful crescendo of their own prowess. It's fantastic. And I think that's also why the world becomes so incomprehensible, why Anor Londo is just slapped down, why the map loops back around on itself, why it's so self-referential, and why things don't really make all that much sense, is because it's also the game trying to say that while we appreciate the people that tried to put thought into mapping out all of the lore and stuff, because obviously they put a lot of work into making the lore make sense and piecing that together, that was never really the point. the point was the emotional experience, the weight that comes from that, what you can learn, the themes, all that stuff is the most important part. And the lore is just there to make the world believable, but focusing on that and making that the main point that you look at and trying to piece together all of the lore, like which king did this, who lived here, what did this town look like before, how, like, where does this connect to this, how does the continent look like, those things aren't important. They make sense because they care and they put work into that, but that's what I get from it, is that those things aren't important. Creating a comprehensive wiki about the Dark Souls world is not the point of Dark Souls. The point is the messages that the game contains and what you can learn from it. And I think that's where people get a little bit offended at this take and this sort of reading of the game, is that they think the game is trying to say you're dumb for caring about the lore, which it's not. That's not what it's trying to say. I don't think that's the point. It's not what I'm trying to say either. But I do think it's trying to say that the way you look at the game is important. Dark Souls 3 makes itself incomprehensible on purpose, to be like, you can't even look at it from that angle anymore. You've got to look at the themes of the game now. You've got to look at what does this game mean to you on an emotional level, more than, you know, the fictional lore of the world. The bosses are also a really great example of this too. Like I said, with Gale and with Frida as well, but also with Prince Lothric too. The way that he's being resurrected to fight like against his will, like this like dying husk. It's really, really telling of the whole idea of like Dark Souls being paraded around, puppeted around, and, you know, kept alive despite the fact that it's probably time to let it die and move on to other things, which is why it only ever makes sense to me to let the flame die at the end of this game. In choosing not to relight the flame, it's really saying that something new can be born from the ashes of what was. Whether it's Sekiro, whether it's Elden Ring, or whether it's a game yet to be, Dark Souls 3, while cynical, is ultimately also a thank you for what was, whilst asking, will you join us for something different? The Painted World is something that solidifies that with the canvas and the way that it references itself continuously over its runtime. The core of Dark Souls 3, to me, is to stop hanging on to what was, to let things grow and to change and to move on without losing the essence of where you came from to, which is why, to me, there never should be a Dark Souls 4. And I do think as long as Miyazaki is there, there won't be one. And I think that's everything I have to say. There's probably more. There's probably plenty more. But I suppose if I'm doing it off the cuff, off the top of my head, it makes sense to just say the things that spoke to me and the things that come to mind. But that being said, there's so much more to say that in years to come, I have no doubts I'll replay these games and have much more to say in a written piece or something a bit more comprehensive. Because I would love to one day, to write a big video essay or something on the Dark Souls games, to really talk about what I feel they do and how they do it. Because they really did speak to me. And this is, I didn't really realize it until just now, but this is sort of like the end of an era here, is I've played Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3 now, so it's time to move on to the other things. Like what the game says, like the message of the game and what I took away from it, it's time to move on to the other things. And I think as well, like for me, with content creation and the way that this game transcends its own context to sort of critique its own self, like as a piece of art, I think really speaks to me with the stuff that I make, because, you know, I think for a long time, and this is getting a little bit introspective, I guess, but I spent a lot of my life making Assassin's Creed videos. That's just what I did, if you're unfamiliar with me from back in the day. I made lots and lots of videos on Assassin's Creed. And I got to a point where I really wanted to move on, and I felt resentment, and I felt, you know, a little bit annoyed at what was. I wanted to move on, and a lot of people sort of wouldn't let me. It's up to me. I can do whatever I want, but people would always bring up Assassin's Creed, always, and it was like, guys, come on, I just want to move on. Let me do other things, please. And it does get frustrating. So in that sense, like, I understand that angle of the game, but I think something else that spoke to me in this game is that eventually you come to terms with what was too. And you sort of can say thank you to everybody that, you know, allowed you to even have a say or create stuff or, like, you know, consume the stuff you made. And so there's that element for me too, in that I've moved on and I make new things now, but I'm no longer frustrated or resentful of what I did before. I appreciate it, and I'm thankful, and I'm glad that I did it, and it's cool that it's there, and it's cool that people will always remember those videos too, and that does mean a lot to me, to have that audience of people that are like, yeah, we loved your Assassin's Creed stuff, that was cool, and it was a big part of their lives, even if for me it's just like a thing that I did that, you know, I didn't put much thought into at the time, I guess. And so I think there sort of is a lesson to be learned here about not being too resentful, you know, of being able to vent those frustrations, but without it taking control of everything you do. You should be able to appreciate where you came from, what you did before, you know? And I think that Dark Souls 3 says a lot for that. And I really appreciate it in that regard. And so that's it for Dark Souls, for now anyway. I'm sure I'll revisit them, like I said, but soon, next, will be Sekiro. Like I've said before, I've already played Bloodborne, so that's why Bloodborne hasn't been in here, and I've also already played Demon's Souls. They might be games that I revisit at some point, and maybe make some sort of video on, but it won't be one of these trying to process videos, because I have already played them fully, and completed them, and really experienced them properly, so I don't think it would be right to replay them and call it, oh, I just finished, or trying to process, because it's like, I've already done that. I've already played both of those. What I'll be doing next is Sekiro at some point. I'm going to take a bit of a break from it all, I think, and then probably next year at some point, jump into Sekiro, and then I'll make a video on that. And then it'll be time for Elden Ring, and obviously, you know, because I'm doing these, I've missed the DLC, but that's fine. I'll come back to it. It'll be fine. I will be able to really take my time, really enjoy Elden Ring properly, because the first time I didn't really vibe with it all that much. And I talk about that in my Dark Souls 1 video, obviously. But that'll be fun. I can't wait for that. Thank you as well to everybody supporting me over on Patreon. While I'm working on bigger projects, the support on Patreon means the absolute world. I'm always doing stuff over there too, whether it's exclusive videos, early access, drafts, recommendations, monthly videos, commentaries, like these go up early over there. I mean, everything I do goes up early over there, but that's there, and I couldn't do this without you guys. So thank you so much. And honestly, I've been loving what we've been putting out over there over the last year or so now. It's been really cool. And thank you as well, of course, as always, to my Patreon producers and master assassins: Cabbage, Dildog, Geek Fam, Jake Durbin, Mackenzie Watson, Arenathon, Callum Thefmus Kelly, Damien, the Not So Orange Gnome, Demi, Flash Paradox, Luke Pierce, and Rollins. Thank you guys so much. I really appreciate you. And also, just as a really quick note, if you're planning to ever join Patreon after November this year, make sure you pledge on any platform other than the iOS app, because after November, Apple are introducing new fees, which are only on the iOS app. You can still use the iOS app to access Patreon and do everything you normally would, just don't pledge through it. Pledge through desktop or Android or whatever. I don't know why Apple are doing this. They suck. Anyway, just for a couple of updates here, because for anyone that watches my stuff regularly, it's worth updating that I am working on this big Doctor Who Series 14 critique. It is coming. It's coming. It's on its way. I promise. I'm getting close. I've taken a bit of a week off here, so when this video comes out, this week, I've taken this week off editing the Doctor Who video so that I can work on a few things that I need to get done, both on YouTube and on Patreon, and sort of ramping up for the 4 Pillars 10-year anniversary, as always, event thing. So that'll be a whole thing, but I do have that big video on its way, okay? It won't be long. Once this video is out, my aim is the end of August. It could be the start of September, but that's my general aim, and so that's the plan. After that, I have some more things. Video on Cars 3, Horizon Zero Dawn I've been replaying for a retrospective on that. I want to remake my original one, so like redo it, because I just don't think it holds up very well. And my other Horizon videos I really like, so it's going to be good to make a video on that. I've been really enjoying that replay. But yeah, that's it from me. Thank you all so much for listening to this video. Let me know your thoughts on Dark Souls 3 in the comments. I would love to get a discussion going and hear what everyone else thinks. It was really nice reading back through everyone's comments on the Dark Souls 2 video, other than everyone was mad at me for not playing the DLC. I apologize again, I'm sorry. But yeah, I want to hear what everyone thinks. It's always super interesting. So leave your comments down below, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye, everyone.